The atmosphere inside the Dirksen Senate office building was charged with a palpable tension that seemed to vibrate against the mahogany-paneled walls of the hearing room. A dense phalanx of photographers crowded the well of the chamber, their shutters clicking in a frantic, rhythmic cacophony that underscored the high stakes of the morning's proceedings. Senator Mazie Hirono sat perched behind the elevated dais, her expression unreadable as she methodically organized a thick stack of briefing papers that contained the few details the agency had been willing to release. Across the divide, FBI Director Kash Patel adjusted the gooseneck microphone, appearing entirely unfazed by the battery of television cameras trained on his face or the murmur of the gallery behind him. The air in the chamber felt thin and electric, heavy with the kind of partisan acrimony that usually precludes any substantive discovery of facts but guarantees a spectacle for the evening news. Senator Hirono initiated the proceedings with a monotone recitation of the committee's rules, though her eyes remained fixed on the witness with a gaze that suggested the administrative pleasantries were merely a prelude to a significant confrontation. She spoke of the sacred duty of oversight and the necessity for federal law enforcement to remain untethered from the capricious winds of political influence. The director listened with a slight, polite nod, his hands clasped on the table in front of him, projecting an image of calm cooperation that stood in stark contrast to the aggressive restructuring efforts he had undertaken since January. This visual dichotomy set the stage for the hours of testimony that would follow, framing the event not just as a bureaucratic check-in, but as a battle for the soul of the institution. As the opening statements concluded, the room fell into a heavy silence, broken only by the rustling of papers as the senator prepared to launch her first line of inquiry. The initial questions were surgical in nature, designed to bypass the usual rhetorical defenses and strike directly at the heart of the agency's recent personnel upheaval. Senator Hirono leaned into her microphone, her voice steady but laced with an unmistakable edge, as she requested the specific number of senior executives who had departed the Bureau since the start of the year. She framed the inquiry as a matter of basic fiscal responsibility and human resource management, avoiding immediate accusations of ideology to see if the director would offer the data voluntarily. Director Patel, however, did not reach for the binder of statistics his aides had placed beside him, choosing instead to answer in broad, conceptual strokes about efficiency and realignment. He spoke of streamlining a bloated command structure and ensuring that agents were deployed to the field rather than idling in headquarters, a response that technically addressed the concept of staffing but conspicuously ignored the request for hard numbers. This evasion prompted an immediate and sharp pivot from the senator, who interrupted the director to remind him that the committee was entitled to specific metrics regarding government employment and attrition rates. She argued that a refusal to quantify the exodus of leadership suggested that the numbers were either alarmingly high or that the reasons for the departures were not purely voluntary. Patel countered without raising his voice, asserting that personnel matters were often sensitive and that his primary focus was on operational output rather than bureaucratic headcounts. He suggested that the true measure of the agency's health was its arrest record and the disruption of criminal networks, not the retention rate of mid-level managers in Washington. The friction between these two worldviews, one demanding institutional stability and the other prioritizing aggressive disruption, became the defining dynamic of the exchange. Hirono pressed further, shifting her focus to the vacuum of leadership within the counterterrorism division, a sector she described as the bedrock of domestic safety. She noted that multiple sources had indicated that key desks responsible for monitoring extremist chatter were now unmanned or staffed by interim appointees with significantly less experience than their predecessors. The implication was clear. She believed that the removal of career professionals had created dangerous blind spots in the nation's security architecture. Director Patel rejected this characterization flatly, arguing that the previous leadership had become too risk-averse and focused on theoretical threats rather than actionable intelligence. He claimed that the new appointees, while perhaps lacking the decades of tenure of the old guard, possessed a hunger and a tactical mindset that was better command-suited for the modern threat landscape. The dialogue then turned to the specific criteria used to select these new leaders, with Hirono asking if political allegiance had been weighed more heavily than operational competence. She cited anonymous whistleblower reports alleging that loyalty tests were being administered informally during interviews for high-level promotions. The director scoffed at the suggestion, characterizing the allegations as the disgruntled rumblings of entrenched bureaucrats who were resistant to necessary change. He insisted that every promotion was based on merit and a shared commitment to the president's directive to restore law and order without apology. This defense did little to assuage the senator, who pointed out that commitment to a directive could easily be interpreted as code for partisan compliance. As the back and forth continued, the senator tried to pin the director down on the status of the agency's relationship with international intelligence partners. She posited that the sudden turnover and the perceived politicization of the Bureau were causing allied nations to hesitate in sharing sensitive data. Patel dismissed this as fear-mongering, stating that his foreign counterparts respected strength and decisiveness above all else. He argued that the agency's previous approach of endless consultation had signaled weakness, whereas his administration was projecting a robust independence that actually garnered more respect on the global stage. The senator looked skeptical, noting that respect and trust were two very different commodities in the world of intelligence sharing. The conversation inevitably drifted toward the allocation of resources, specifically the redirection of funds and manpower toward immigration enforcement at the southern border. Hirono questioned whether reassignment of agents from financial crimes and domestic terrorism units to border operations was leaving the country vulnerable to white-collar fraud and internal extremist violence. She painted a picture of an agency being hollowed out from the inside, its diverse portfolio of responsibilities cannibalized to serve a single, politically charged objective. The director defended the resource shift as a direct response to the most pressing clear and present danger facing the homeland. He argued that border security was national security, and that the distinction the senator was trying to draw was an artifact of a pre-crisis mindset. Hirono's frustration became increasingly visible as she attempted to get a straight answer regarding the future of the agency's Civil Rights Division. She asked if the rumors were true that the division's budget was being slashed to pay for the increased operational tempo at the border. Patel avoided a simple yes or no, instead launching into a monologue about the need to protect the civil rights of victims of violent crime. He reframed the concept of civil rights protection as the duty to ensure safe streets for law-abiding citizens, subtly implying that the division's previous focus on systemic oversight had been misplaced. This rhetorical sleight of hand drew a sharp rebuke from a senator, who accused him of redefining statutory language to suit an agenda. The tension in the room spiked when Hirono brought up the issue of transparency regarding the agency's new violent crime task forces. She demanded to know why these units were operating with reduced reporting requirements and why their engagement protocols had not been shared with the Oversight Committee. The director replied that revealing tactical protocols would endanger his agents and give criminals a blueprint to evade capture. He insisted that oversight did not grant Congress the right to micromanage tactical decisions in real time. The senator countered that without transparency, there was no way to ensure that these task forces were operating within the bounds of the Constitution. This fundamental disagreement over the balance between liberty and security hung heavy in the air, with neither side willing to cede an inch of ground. The senator's questions grew more rapid-fire, attempting to catch the director in a contradiction or force a slip of the tongue. Patel remained disciplined, his answers short and repetitive, often circling back to the themes of safety, order, and the mandate of the election. The gallery watched in rapt silence, witnessing a collision between the legislative branch's demand for accountability and the executive branch's assertion of prerogative. It was a classic constitutional struggle, played out in the sterile, fluorescent-lit theater of a Senate hearing room. As the first hour of testimony drew to a close, it became clear that the senator was not going to get the data she sought, and the director was not going to get the validation he desired. The record was being filled with non-answers and reframings, creating a transcript that would be parsed by legal scholars and political pundits for weeks to come. Hirono signaled that she was pivoting to a new line of questioning, one that would focus on the specific individuals who had been removed from command. She warned the director that she had names and dates, and that she intended to read them into the record if he would not confirm them. This threat hung in the air, a final escalation before the committee took a brief recess to consult with counsel. The gavel struck the sounding block with a sharp, resonant crack that seemed to sever the murmur of the room, signaling the end of the recess and the resumption of a hearing that had already begun to veer into hostile territory. Senator Hirono adjusted her glasses, the reflection of the overhead lights obscuring her eyes for a brief moment as she looked down at the dossier that had been prepared by her staff during the break. The brief intermission had done nothing to cool the temperature in the chamber. If anything, the silence that now settled over the audience was heavier, laden with the anticipation of the specific confrontation that the senator had promised before the suspension. Director Patel sat motionless, his posture rigid and his expression composed, betraying no anxiety about the list of names that was about to be read into the congressional record. The air was thick with the unsaid, the political subtext that transformed every administrative query into a referendum on the current administration's philosophy of governance. Senator Hirono began not with a question, but with a litany of departures that painted a stark picture of a hollowed-out command structure at the Hoover Building. She recited the names of the Assistant Director of the Counterterrorism Division, the Chief of the Cyber Response Unit, and the Deputy Assistant Director for Intelligence, pausing after each title to let the weight of the vacancy sink into the consciousness of the room. She noted that these were not junior agents or political appointees who cycle out with every administration, but career civil servants with decades of specialized experience in hunting down the nation's most dangerous adversaries. The senator looked up from her paper, her voice rising slightly as she asked the director to confirm that these positions were currently filled by individuals holding the title in an acting capacity. The implication was that the agency was operating with a temporary, perhaps unqualified, leadership team that lacked the statutory authority and long-term vision required for such critical roles. Director Patel leaned forward to the microphone, his demeanor suggesting that he viewed this line of questioning as a tedious attachment to the past rather than a relevant critique of the present. He confirmed that the positions were indeed held by acting officials, but he immediately framed this fluidity as a strategic advantage rather than an operational liability. He argued that the previous occupants of those offices had become entrenched in a bureaucratic mindset that prioritized process over outcomes, and that their departures, whether voluntary or encouraged, had opened the door for fresh thinking. The director asserted that the acting leaders were field-tested agents who understood the reality of the street, implying that the departed executives had spent too much time in conference rooms and not enough time confronting the criminal element. This dismissal of institutional memory as bureaucratic bloat struck a nerve with the senator, who viewed the accumulation of experience as the primary asset of an intelligence agency. Hirono pressed the attack, shifting the focus to the specific consequences of this brain drain on the agency's ability to monitor complex international terror networks. She argued that counterterrorism is a discipline that relies heavily on relationships, historical knowledge, and the ability to connect seemingly unrelated dots over long periods of time. By purging the senior ranks, she contended, the director had effectively lobotomized the division, severing the connective tissue that allowed the FBI to anticipate threats before they materialized on American soil. She asked if the director had conducted any risk assessment to determine how the loss of combined centuries of experience would impact the agency's predictive capabilities. Her question was rhetorical in its delivery, designed to highlight what she perceived as a reckless disregard for the intricate craft of intelligence work in favor of a blunt force approach to law enforcement. Patel's response was indicative of the fundamental ideological shift he was spearheading within the Bureau, as he rejected the premise that the old way of doing business was worth preserving. He stated that the threat landscape had evolved, moving away from the complex, hierarchical terror cells of the early 2000s toward a more diffuse and chaotic environment driven by border insecurity and transnational criminal organizations. He argued that the predictive capabilities the senator praised had failed to stop the influx of fentanyl and human trafficking that he identified as the true terror threats facing American communities. In his view, the Counterterrorism Division had become an academic exercise, producing white papers on theoretical risks while ignoring the tangible, physical danger accumulating at the southern border. This pivot, redefining terrorism to include cartel activity and border crossings, was a calculated move to align the agency's mission with the administration's political priorities. The senator seized on this conflation of immigration enforcement and counterterrorism, accusing the director of misappropriating resources mandated by Congress for specific national security functions. She cited a leaked internal memorandum that allegedly authorized the transfer of nearly 30% of the counterterrorism analysis staff to duties related to vetting asylum claims and tracking undocumented migrants. Hirono characterized this as a bait and switch on the American taxpayer, arguing that funds appropriated to stop bomb plots and cyber attacks were being siphoned off to support a political narrative about an invasion. She demanded to know under what legal authority the director had unilaterally redefined the scope of the counterterrorism mission to include immigration processing. The accusation was sharp. She was suggesting that the director was breaking the law to serve the president's agenda. Patel remained unflappable, countering that the greatest vector for terrorism entering the United States was the porous border, and therefore, securing it was the highest form of counterterrorism. He argued that the distinction between a terrorist and a criminal alien was often a distinction without a difference until it was too late, and that his duty was to prevent entry rather than to investigate after the fact. He dismissed the senator's concern about misappropriated funds as a misunderstanding of the agency's flexible mandate to address immediate threats to public safety. The director posited that the American people did not care which budget bucket the money came from, as long as it resulted in safe neighborhoods and a secure perimeter. This utilitarian defense, that the ends justify the budgetary means, highlighted the chasm between the senator's proceduralism and the director's pragmatism. The dialogue then turned to the specific issue of domestic violent extremism, DVA, a priority area for the previous administration that Hirono feared was being dismantled under Patel's watch. She pointed out that the FBI's own data from prior years had identified racially and ethnically motivated violent extremism as the most lethal domestic threat. The senator asked the director why the task force dedicated to investigating these groups had reportedly been reduced in size, and why the terminology used in internal reports had been altered to remove references to specific ideologies. She suggested that the agency was being willfully blind to right-wing extremism because acknowledging it was politically inconvenient for the White House. This was a direct challenge to Patel's integrity, implying that he was shielding political allies from scrutiny. Director Patel bristled slightly at this accusation, his voice taking on a harder edge as he defended his decision to reallocate resources away from what he termed ideological policing. He stated that the FBI investigates violence, not thoughts, and that the previous focus on DVE had drifted dangerously close to infringing on First Amendment rights. He argued that the agency should not be in the business of monitoring chat rooms for offensive speech, but rather investigating individuals who are mobilizing for violence regardless of their motivation. He claimed that the recalibration of the unit was intended to focus on actual kinetic threats, rather than statistical inflation of cases to suit a political narrative. By framing the previous administration's efforts as an overreach, he attempted to position his retrenchment as a restoration of civil liberties, a reversal of the usual partisan roles. Hirono was not persuaded, reading from a prepared statement that detailed several recent incidents of hate-fueled violence that she claimed might have been prevented with more robust monitoring. She argued that the director's definition of actual violence was reactive, waiting for a tragedy to occur rather than interdicting the radicalization process. She accused him of dismantling the early warning systems that protected vulnerable communities, effectively telling those communities that their safety was less important than the administration's desire to minimize the threat of white supremacy. The senator's line of questioning sought to portray the director's policies not just as inefficient, but as morally culpable for future violence. The emotional weight of her argument filled the room, challenging the director to look at the human cost of his strategic decisions. The director countered by citing statistics on violent crime in major cities, pivoting the conversation back to his preferred ground of law and order in the streets. He argued that while the senator was focused on the rare and sensational instances of ideological violence, thousands of Americans were being victimized daily by gang violence, carjackings, and drug-related shootings. He asserted that the FBI had a moral obligation to assist overwhelmed local police departments in restoring order to urban centers, and that this required a massive shift of manpower from intelligence desks to violent crime task forces. Patel presented this as a populist mandate. The FBI was returning to its roots as a crime-fighting agency rather than a domestic intelligence service. He implied that the senator's priorities were out of touch with the daily realities of the average citizen. The back and forth grew increasingly technical as Hirono drilled down into the mechanics of these violent crime task forces. She asked about the rules of engagement and the oversight mechanisms in place to ensure that federal agents operating in local jurisdictions were not overstepping their authority. She raised concerns about the lack of body camera usage and the reports of aggressive tactics being used in low-level arrests. The senator painted a picture of a federal police force being unleashed on American cities with little accountability, operating under a mandate to produce numbers at any cost. She asked if the director was measuring success by the number of arrests or by the justice of the outcomes, hinting that the agency was juking the stats to show progress. Patel defended his agents fiercely, stating that they were risking their lives to take repeat offenders off the streets and that they deserved support, not suspicion, from Congress. He argued that the hand-wringing over procedural details was exactly why crime had been allowed to spiral out of control in the first place. He claimed that criminals had become emboldened by a system that scrutinized the police more than the perpetrators, and that his FBI was sending a clear message that the era of impunity was over. The director's rhetoric was sharp and uncompromising, framing the hearing as a choice between chaos and control. He refused to apologize for the aggressive posture of his agency, viewing it as a necessary corrective to years of leniency. As the second hour of testimony ground on, the philosophical divide between Hirono and Patel seemed to widen into an unbridgeable chasm. The senator viewed the FBI as a sophisticated intelligence apparatus that needed to be carefully calibrated to protect civil liberties while preempting complex threats. The director viewed the FBI as a hammer, a blunt instrument to be wielded against the visible manifestations of disorder, gangs, drugs, and borders. Every answer Patel gave reinforced his commitment to this physical, tangible version of law enforcement, while every question Hirono asked underscored her fear that the intellectual and analytical core of the Bureau was being rotted out. The clash was not just about personnel or budgets. It was about the very purpose of federal law enforcement in a divided democracy. Hirono concluded this segment of her questioning by returning to the issue of the border, specifically the diversion of cybersecurity experts to assist with physical surveillance. She asked the director if he genuinely believed that a cyber analyst was best utilized watching a camera feed of a desert crossing rather than monitoring the networks of foreign adversaries. She characterized this as a gross mismanagement of talent, akin to using a neurosurgeon to bandage a scraped knee. The analogy drew a few murmurs from the press gallery, highlighting the absurdity of the resource allocation from a traditionalist perspective. The senator wanted to put on the record that the director was wasting millions of dollars in training and clearance costs for political optics. Patel's response was cool and dismissive, asserting that in a time of crisis, it was all hands on deck. He argued that the cyber threat was real, but it was abstract compared to the physical invasion of the border. He stated that until the border was secure, no other national security priority could be fully addressed, as a porous border undermined the sovereignty upon which all other security rests. He rejected the premise that talent was being wasted, arguing that service to the mission was the only metric that mattered. This final exchange of the session encapsulated the entire conflict, a battle between the specialized, compartmentalized view of the deep state and the totalizing, crisis-driven view of the new populism. The room held its breath as the senator prepared to shift her focus once again, this time toward the murky waters of political retaliation within the ranks. The hearing room seemed to contract as Senator Hirono opened a new, color-coded file folder, the distinct sound of the heavy cardstock echoing in the sudden quiet that had befallen the chamber. She adjusted the microphone with a deliberate slowness, signaling to everyone present that the previous discussions on budgets and border resources were merely the preamble to a much darker chapter of the oversight session. This segment of the inquiry was dedicated to the internal atmosphere of the Bureau, specifically the allegations of systemic retaliation against career employees who had voiced dissent regarding the new administration's directives. Hirono looked over the rim of her glasses at Director Patel, her demeanor shifting from administrative scrutiny to that of a prosecutor laying out a case of witness intimidation. She began by citing a disturbing statistic regarding the unprecedented spike in the revocation and suspension of security clearances for tenured agents since January. The senator detailed the cases of 3 specific senior analysts who had been stripped of their clearances and placed on indefinite unpaid leave within weeks of the leadership transition. She noted that all 3 individuals had previously received stellar performance evaluations and had been involved in investigations that were politically sensitive to the current White House. Hirono characterized these suspensions not as legitimate security protocols, but as a weaponized human resources tactic designed to purge ideological opponents without the hassle of a formal termination process. She argued that by suspending a clearance, the agency could effectively fire an agent by rendering them unable to work, all while denying them the due process protections that would accompany a standard firing. The senator demanded to know what specific security concerns had suddenly arisen for these veterans of the Bureau, implying that their only crime was a lack of fealty to the new regime. Director Patel leaned into the microphone, his expression hardening as he rejected the premise that these personnel actions were anything other than necessary housekeeping. He stated that a security clearance is a privilege, not a right, and that the agency had a zero-tolerance policy for individuals who demonstrated a lack of candor or an inability to follow the chain of command. He alluded to internal leaks and unauthorized disclosures that had plagued the agency for years, suggesting that the suspended agents were part of a culture of insubordination that he was brought in to dismantle. The director argued that the previous administration had allowed a lax security environment to fester, where agents felt entitled to judge the validity of orders rather than executing them. He framed the suspensions as a restoration of discipline, a necessary shock to the system to remind the workforce that their oath was to the Constitution and the chain of command, not to their own personal political judgments. Hirono was quick to counter, pointing out that unauthorized disclosures was often a euphemism used by embarrassed leaders to punish whistleblowers who exposed misconduct. She read from a letter provided by the Office of the Inspector General, which expressed grave concern that the Bureau's Internal Security Division was being used to hunt down internal critics rather than foreign spies. The senator asked if the director was aware of the Whistleblower Protection Act and if he understood that reporting waste, fraud, or abuse to Congress was a protected activity, not a security violation. She accused him of creating a culture of fear where honest agents were terrified to speak up about illegal orders lest they lose their livelihoods and pensions. Her voice grew sharper as she described the chilling effect this was having on the rank and file, silencing the very people who were supposed to be the moral compass of the institution. Patel dismissed the whistleblower label as a shield often used by partisan actors to leak selective information damaging to the administration. He argued that there was a bright line between a legitimate whistleblower and a leaker who undermines the agency's mission from within, and he insisted that his administration was only targeting the latter. He claimed that true whistleblowers had nothing to fear, but that those who used the guise of protected disclosure to leak classified information to the press would be hunted down and prosecuted. The director's definition of a leaker appeared to be expansively broad, encompassing anyone who communicated with the media or oversight committees without explicit authorization. This stance drew a murmur of disapproval from the Democratic side of the dais, who viewed this as a direct assault on congressional oversight capabilities. The conversation then shifted to the controversial restructuring of the Office of Professional Responsibility, OPR, the internal watchdog meant to adjudicate misconduct. Hirono alleged that the director had installed loyalists at the head of OPR and had rewritten the adjudication guidelines to favor agents who were aggressive in the field while punishing those who raised ethical concerns. She cited reports that disciplinary files for agents accused of excessive force were being administratively closed, while files were being opened on agents who had questioned the legality of the new border operations. The senator argued that this created a two-tiered system of justice within the Bureau itself: impunity for the cowboys who supported the director's agenda, and scrutiny for the Boy Scouts who insisted on following the rules. She asked how the public could trust the FBI to enforce the law fairly if it could not even apply its own internal rules without bias. Director Patel defended the changes at OPR as a necessary correction to an internal justice system that had become paralyzed by political correctness and risk aversion. He argued that under the previous leadership, agents were so afraid of being investigated for a procedural misstep that they hesitated to act in life-or-death situations, endangering themselves and the public. He claimed that he was unshackling his agents, giving them the confidence to do their jobs without looking over their shoulders for a bureaucrat with a clipboard. He insisted that he was not condoning misconduct, but rather distinguishing between malicious intent and the split-second decisions made in the fog of operational reality. This fog of war defense was a clear signal to the field agents watching the broadcast that the new boss had their backs, a populist move designed to shore up his support among the gun carriers. Senator Hirono, however, saw this as a dangerous erosion of standards that would inevitably lead to civil rights violations and costly lawsuits. She pivoted to the specific issue of the political bias training that had reportedly been made mandatory for all senior executives and field office heads. She held up a leaked slide from the training deck which listed institutional resistance and administrative state mentality as threats to the agency's mission. Hirono asked the director to explain why the FBI was spending tax dollars to indoctrinate its leadership with political talking points that seemed lifted directly from a campaign rally. She characterized the training not as professional development, but as a re-education camp designed to enforce ideological conformity at the highest levels of the Bureau. Patel did not deny the existence of the training but vigorously defended its content as essential for aligning the agency with the democratic will of the people as expressed in the last election. He argued that the administrative state was a real phenomenon where unelected officials obstructed the policy goals of elected leaders, and that it was his duty to ensure that the FBI was responsive to the president. He stated that the training was designed to break the arrogance of the career bureaucracy and remind them that they served at the pleasure of the executive branch. The director framed this as a matter of democratic accountability, asserting that when the voters chose a new direction for the country, the civil service had an obligation to facilitate, not hinder, that change. The clash here was fundamental. Hirono viewed the civil service as a stabilizer and a check on power. Patel viewed it as an obstacle to be overcome. The questioning deepened as Hirono brought up the forced transfers of special agents in charge, SACs, from several major metropolitan field offices, including Washington, D.C., New York, and San Francisco. She noted that these transfers were irregular, occurring outside the normal rotation cycle, and that the replacements were individuals who had previously expressed strong support for the director's controversial theories on the weaponization of government. The senator suggested that the director was strategically placing loyalists in charge of the offices that would likely handle investigations into the administration's political enemies. She asked if these personnel moves were a prelude to a new wave of politically motivated investigations, effectively turning the FBI into a private police force for the White House. The accusation hung heavy in the room, touching on the darkest fears of the opposition regarding the collapse of the rule of law. Director Patel responded with a cool dismissal, claiming that the field officers in question had been underperforming and were plagued by a culture of leakage and partisanship. He argued that he had the authority and the responsibility to place the most effective leaders in the most critical positions, regardless of the calendar or the complaints of the establishment. He stated that the new SACs were mission-focused leaders who would restore integrity to offices that had become too cozy with the local political machines. The director accused the senator of projecting her own party's history of politicizing the DOJ onto his administration, claiming that he was merely leveling the playing field. This whataboutism was a recurring tactic, using the perceived sins of the past to justify the aggressive actions of the present. Hirono then turned to the recruitment pipeline, expressing concern over reports that the FBI Academy at Quantico had altered its admission standards to deprioritize academic credentials in favor of life experience and physical fitness. She questioned whether this shift was a deliberate attempt to change the demographic and intellectual profile of the agent population, moving away from lawyers and accountants toward a more militaristic cohort. The senator cited anecdotal evidence that recruitment drives were now focusing heavily on military bases and police departments in specific regions, while presence at elite universities had dwindled. She feared that this would result in a homogenized workforce that lacked the diversity of thought and background necessary to investigate complex financial crimes or cyber espionage. She saw it as the militarization of a civilian law enforcement agency. Patel embraced the shift in recruitment strategy, arguing that the FBI needed warriors, not academics, to confront the violent threats facing the nation. He claimed that the previous emphasis on recruiting from Ivy League institutions had filled the ranks with individuals who were out of touch with mainstream America and hesitant to use force when necessary. He stated that he wanted agents who had dirt under their fingernails and who understood the visceral reality of evil, rather than those who had only studied it in a sociology textbook. The director positioned this as a populist democratization of the agency, opening the doors to patriots from working-class backgrounds who had previously been shut out by elitist credentialism. To Hirono, however, it looked like the deliberate construction of a Praetorian Guard. The tension escalated when Hirono read a quote attributed to the director from a closed-door meeting, where he allegedly told senior staff that the FBI is part of the executive branch, not the judicial branch. She asked him to clarify this statement, interpreting it as a rejection of the agency's quasi-independent status and its role as a seeker of objective truth. The senator argued that while the FBI is technically within the DOJ, its credibility relies on a degree of separation from the political whims of the president. She warned that viewing the FBI as a mere arm of the White House would destroy public trust and lead to the kind of abuses seen during the Hoover era. It was a plea for institutional norms, a defense of the guardrails that were supposed to protect democracy. Patel did not back down, doubling down on the constitutional theory of the unitary executive. He lectured the committee on Article 2 of the Constitution, asserting that all executive power is vested in the president and that any degree of independence claimed by the bureaucracy is a fiction. He argued that the idea of an independent FBI was a modern invention used by the deep state to insulate itself from accountability to the voters. The director stated clearly that he took his orders from the president and that his agents would execute those orders within the bounds of the law, but without the pretended neutrality that he claimed was a mask for liberal bias. This was a direct articulation of the administration's legal theory, that the president is the absolute master of the executive branch and the FBI is his instrument. Hirono sat back for a moment, letting the magnitude of that admission settle over the room. She looked at her colleagues, then back at the witness, her expression one of profound concern. She noted for the record that the director had just essentially declared the end of the FBI's independence, a statement she predicted would have chilling ramifications for the future of civil liberties in America. She warned that if the FBI became nothing more than a political enforcement squad, the country would be taking a dark step toward authoritarianism. The senator's rhetoric was grave, stripping away the bureaucratic language to expose the raw power struggle at the heart of the hearing. The director remained unmoved, staring back with a look of defiance. He retorted that the true threat to democracy was an unelected bureaucracy that believed it knew better than the people's chosen representatives. He accused the senator and her party of wanting an FBI that was independent only when it served their interests, but compliant when they held the reins of power. He claimed that he was restoring the proper constitutional order, where the security apparatus is subservient to the elected sovereign. As the session neared its next break, the lines of battle were drawn not just over policy, but over the very definition of democratic governance. The room felt smaller, the air tighter, as the realization dawned that there was no common ground to be found here, only a fight for dominance. The afternoon sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting long, oblique shadows across the hearing room that seemed to mirror the darkening mood of the proceedings. Senator Hirono, having exhausted her inquiries regarding internal personnel shifts and border policies, now turned her attention to the most volatile subject of the day, the status of politically sensitive investigations and the Bureau's coordination with the Department of Justice. She opened a new binder, the spine of which was marked with red tape, signaling that the contents pertained to active and potentially classified case matters. The senator's voice dropped an octave, becoming grave and deliberate, as she accused the director of participating in a coordinated effort to weaponize the federal justice system against the administration's political rivals. She cited specific reports indicating that the FBI had recently opened preliminary inquiries into several prominent critics of the president, utilizing statutes that are rarely invoked in political contexts. Hirono began by referencing the sudden and unexplained closure of hundreds of cases related to the events of January 6, 2021, a move she characterized as a blanket amnesty for insurrectionists. She noted that fugitive task forces, which had spent years tracking down individuals who assaulted law enforcement officers at the Capitol, had been effectively disbanded or reassigned to other duties. The senator asked the director to explain the legal justification for abandoning the pursuit of justice for those who had violently attacked the seat of government. She argued that this decision sent a dangerous message that political violence was acceptable, provided it was committed in service of the right political cause. The silence in the room was deafening as everyone awaited the director's explanation for what appeared to be a stunning reversal of federal law enforcement priority. Director Patel met the accusation with a steely gaze, rejecting the term amnesty, and instead describing the shift as a necessary reallocation of finite prosecutorial resources. He argued that the previous administration had engaged in a dragnet of persecution, targeting Americans who had merely trespassed or engaged in nonviolent protest, while ignoring the widespread arson and looting that had consumed American cities during the summer of 2020. He stated that his FBI was committed to equal justice under the law, which meant ending the disparity where one side's rioters were treated as domestic terrorists and the other side's rioters were treated as social justice warriors. Patel claimed that the agency was simply prioritizing the investigation of the most egregious violent offenders, regardless of their ideology, and that the resources freed up from the J6 dragnet were being used to target transnational gangs. He framed the closure of these cases as a corrective measure to restore balance to a justice system that had been tilted by partisan bias. The senator was visibly agitated by this moral equivalence, slamming her hand on the dais as she reminded the director that an attack on the peaceful transfer of power was fundamentally different from civil unrest. She accused him of rewriting history to suit a political narrative, effectively gaslighting the country about the severity of the threat posed by anti-democratic extremism. Hirono pointed out that the resource reallocation defense crumbled under scrutiny, given that the agency had simultaneously ramped up investigations into charitable foundations and think tanks associated with the opposition party. She asked specifically about the new Foreign Influence Task Force, which, according to whistleblowers, was exclusively targeting liberal-leaning NGOs while ignoring foreign funding of conservative groups. This, she argued, was the definition of weaponization, using the immense power of the state to harass and intimidate political enemies. Patel defended the new task force aggressively, asserting that for too long, foreign adversaries had been allowed to launder influence through non-profit organizations that operated without scrutiny. He claimed that the previous administration had turned a blind eye to this dark money because it benefited their political allies, and that he was merely enforcing the Foreign Agents Registration Act, FORA, without fear or favor. The director insisted that if conservative groups were found to be violating the law, they would be investigated with equal vigor, though he offered no examples of such active probes. He characterized the senator's objections as an attempt to protect a corrupt status quo that relied on foreign cash to influence American policy. His rhetoric painted the FBI as the new champion of sovereignty, cleansing the political system of malign foreign influence regardless of where the chips fell. The dialogue then shifted to the role of the Attorney General and the perceived erosion of the firewall that traditionally separates the White House from the day-to-day operations of the Justice Department. Hirono produced a log of visitor records and phone calls indicating a high frequency of contact between the FBI Director's Office and the White House counsel, a breach of norms that she described as Nixonian. She asked the director to disclose the substance of these conversations and whether the president or his aides had ever suggested or directed the initiation of a specific criminal investigation. The senator warned that any coordination between the White House and the FBI on criminal matters would constitute an impeachable abuse of power and a violation of the director's oath. She was drawing a line in the sand, daring the director to admit that the agency had become a political arm of the West Wing. Director Patel scoffed at the firewall concept, calling it a polite fiction that had never truly existed and was only invoked to shield the deep state from democratic oversight. He argued that the president is the chief law enforcement officer of the country, and that it is entirely appropriate for the FBI director to consult with the commander-in-chief on matters of national priority. He stated that their conversations focused on strategic goals and policy implementation, not the micromanagement of individual cases, though he refused to offer a categorical denial regarding specific targets. Patel posited that the American people elected the president to run the government, including the Department of Justice, and that the idea of an unelected, unaccountable bureaucracy operating independently was anti-democratic. This interpretation of the unitary executive theory effectively collapsed the distinction between policy and prosecution, leaving Hirono stunned by the brazen rejection of post-Watergate norms. Hirono pressed him further on the specific case of a former cabinet member from the opposing party who had recently been indicted on corruption charges that legal experts described as novel and tenuous. She asked if the timing of the indictment, coming just weeks before the midterm election cycle, was coincidental or coordinated to maximize political damage. The senator suggested that the FBI was resurrecting zombie cases, investigations that had been closed for lack of evidence by career prosecutors, and breathing new life into them under pressure from political appointees. She characterized this as lawfare, the use of legal systems and institutions to damage or delegitimize an opponent. Hirono argued that this behavior turned the United States into a banana republic, where the winner of an election jails the loser. The director rejected the accusation of lawfare with a sharp rebuke, stating that no one is above the law, regardless of their former title or political standing. He argued that the previous administration had protected its own, burying evidence of corruption to maintain power, and that his agency was simply doing the job that should have been done years ago. Patel claimed that the timing of the indictments was dictated by the facts and the pace of the investigation, not the electoral calendar. He accused the senator of advocating for a two-tiered system of justice where the political elite are immune from prosecution, while ordinary citizens bear the full weight of the law. This populist defense, that he was the one truly fighting for equality before the law, was designed to resonate with a public cynical about government corruption. The questioning then turned to the FBI's interaction with social media companies, a topic that had been the subject of intense controversy in previous years. Hirono asked if the director had dismantled the disinformation working groups that facilitated communication between the Bureau and tech platforms regarding foreign election interference. She cited reports that the FBI had ceased all contact with these companies, leaving the digital public square vulnerable to Russian and Chinese bot farms. The senator argued that by withdrawing from this space, the FBI was effectively inviting foreign adversaries to sow discord and confusion in the American electorate. She implied that this withdrawal was intentional, driven by a political belief that disinformation efforts tended to favor the director's own party. Patel confirmed that the censorship industrial complex, as he termed it, had been dismantled on his first day in office. He argued that the FBI had no business policing speech or telling private companies what content to suppress, describing the previous arrangement as a violation of the First Amendment by proxy. He stated that the agency would focus on identifying foreign intelligence officers operating on U.S. soil, not on moderating the content of tweets or posts. The director claimed that the best defense against disinformation was a free marketplace of ideas, not a government truth ministry that decided which narratives were acceptable. His stance was a complete repudiation of the agency's prior role in securing the cognitive infrastructure of the nation, framing it instead as government overreach. Hirono pivoted back to the issue of domestic terrorism, asking about the status of investigations into attacks on reproductive health clinics. She noted that violence against these facilities had risen sharply, yet the number of federal indictments remained near zero. The senator asked if the director had deprioritized these cases because they did not fit the administration's ideological agenda. She contrasted this inaction with the aggressive pursuit of environmental activists who had engaged in nonviolent civil disobedience. Hirono painted a picture of selective enforcement, where the severity of the government's response depended entirely on the political viewpoint of the perpetrator. Director Patel responded that the FBI investigates violence wherever it finds it, but he disputed the premise that clinic violence was a systemic threat comparable to other forms of crime. He suggested that many of the incidents cited by the senator were matters for local law enforcement, not the federal government. He argued that the FBI's limited resources had to be focused on high-impact threats, such as human trafficking and fentanyl distribution, rather than policing vandalism at clinics. This response, effectively minimizing the federal role in protecting civil rights access, drew a sharp intake of breath from the senator. It underscored the fundamental shift in the agency's priorities, away from civil rights enforcement and toward a hardline focus on street crime and border security. As the hearing entered its final hour, Hirono raised the issue of the leak investigations that were reportedly targeting journalists who had published stories critical of the administration. She asked if the FBI had seized the phone records or emails of any reporters without their knowledge, a practice that had been restricted under previous guidelines. The senator warned that targeting the free press was a hallmark of authoritarian regimes, and that the First Amendment protected the right of journalists to cultivate sources. She asked the director to commit, under oath, that he would not use the powers of the FBI to unmask confidential sources or intimidate the media. Patel refused to make such a blanket commitment, stating that journalists do not have a get-out-of-jail-free card if they solicit or publish classified national defense information. He argued that the leaks of the past few years had caused grave damage to national security and that he had a duty to plug those leaks by any legal means necessary. He distinguished between legitimate reporting and espionage, suggesting that some modern journalism crossed the line into criminal conduct. The director's refusal to rule out surveillance of the press sent a chill through the gallery, where dozens of reporters were furiously taking notes. It was a clear signal that the détente between the security state and the Fourth Estate was over. Hirono then brought up the morale of the workforce, asking if the director was aware of the record number of stress-related disability claims filed by agents in the past 6 months. She read an anonymous testimonial from a veteran agent who described the current atmosphere as toxic and paranoid, with agents afraid to put anything in writing for fear of retribution. The senator asked if the director cared that he was breaking the spirit of the men and women who served under him. She argued that a demoralized FBI was a weak FBI, and that his leadership style was destroying the very institution he claimed to be saving. Patel dismissed the testimonial as the whining of a soft contingent that was unsuited for the rigors of real law enforcement work. He claimed that for every disgruntled agent who left or complained, there were 10 eager recruits ready to take their place who believed in the new mission. He argued that he was building a harder, leaner, more lethal agency that was stripped of the woke mind virus that had infected the previous culture. The director stated that morale among the true believers was higher than ever, because they finally had leadership that let them do their jobs. This ruthless Darwinian view of the workforce, purge the weak to strengthen the strong, was the final philosophical conflict of the session. The senator closed her folder, the sound of the cover hitting the table echoing like a final judgment. She looked at the director with a mixture of pity and resolve, stating that history would not judge his tenure kindly. She warned him that the pendulum of politics always swings back, and that the precedents he was setting today would eventually be used against him and his allies. Hirono declared that the damage being done to the rule of law might take a generation to repair, but that the Oversight Committee would not cease its efforts to hold him accountable. The director simply nodded, a faint, confident smile playing on his lips, as if he knew that the real power lay not in this room, but in the executive orders he would sign as soon as he returned to headquarters. The session was adjourned, but the war for the FBI was far from over. The heavy oak doors of the committee room swung open, releasing a flood of spectators, staffers, and journalists into the marble corridors of the Dirksen building, where the chaotic energy of the post-hearing spin room immediately took hold. The air was thick with the cacophony of shouting reporters and the blinding flash of cameras, capturing the immediate reactions of the political combatants as they exited the arena. Senator Hirono stopped at a cluster of microphones, her expression grave and exhausted, to reiterate her warning that the day's testimony represented a funeral procession for the independence of federal law enforcement. She characterized the director's answers not merely as evasive, but as a defiant admission that the FBI had been transformed into a partisan weapon acting at the behest of the executive branch. Across the hallway, Director Patel stood surrounded by a phalanx of security, projecting an image of victorious strength as he told friendly outlets that he had successfully defended the agency against the theater of the absurd orchestrated by the opposition. The media reaction to the hearing was immediate and predictably bifurcated, illustrating the fragmented reality of the American information landscape in the mid-2020s. On conservative cable networks, Patel was hailed as a hero, a slayer of the deep state who had finally stood up to the entrenched bureaucracy and the liberal oversight apparatus. His clips were packaged into viral montages set to dramatic music, emphasizing his refusals to apologize for the aggressive border policies and his dismissal of woke internal training. Commentators on these platforms argued that his testimony was a necessary corrective, a reassertion of democratic control over an agency that had gone rogue under previous administrations. To this demographic, the director's belligerence was not a flaw but a feature, proof that he was fighting for the forgotten men and women against a corrupt elite. Conversely, legacy media outlets and liberal commentary circles depicted the hearing as a terrifying glimpse into a sliding authoritarianism, framing the director's testimony as a blueprint for a police state. Editorials in major newspapers warned that the dismantling of the firewall between the White House and the Justice Department was a crossing of the Rubicon from which the Republic might never recover. Legal analysts parsed the transcript for hours, highlighting the director's refusal to rule out the surveillance of journalists and his expansive definition of domestic enemies as evidence of a dangerous new legal theory. For this segment of the public, the hearing was a confirmation of their worst fears, that the institutions designed to protect the rule of law were being hollowed out and repurposed to serve the whims of a single leader. The contrast in coverage meant that two distinct narratives emerged, with no overlapping consensus on what had actually transpired in the hearing room. In the days following the hearing, the impact on the internal culture of the FBI became even more pronounced, accelerating the trends that Hirono had tried to expose. The acting directors and interim chiefs whom Patel had defended were quietly moved into permanent positions, cementing the new leadership structure without the need for further Senate confirmation battles. Reports from inside the Hoover building suggested a great silencing, where career agents who had previously been vocal about policy concerns simply ceased to speak up, opting to keep their heads down to survive until retirement. The few remaining dissenters were isolated, their security clearances stuck in perpetual review, while those who embraced the new mission-first ethos were fast-tracked for promotion. The message sent by the director's defiant performance was received loud and clear by the rank and file. The old rules no longer applied, and loyalty was the new currency of the realm. The chilling effect extended beyond the walls of the Bureau, permeating the broader civil society and the network of non-governmental organizations that monitored government overreach. Several prominent civil liberties groups announced that they were upgrading their digital security protocols and moving sensitive data to offshore servers, fearing that they were now targets of the new Foreign Influence Task Force. Investigative journalists began to use burner phones and encrypted couriers for routine communications, operating with a paranoia usually reserved for correspondents in dictatorial regimes. The director's refusal to disavow the prosecution of the press had fundamentally altered the risk calculus for the Fourth Estate, leading to a noticeable decrease in the number of leaks coming out of the administration. The silence that fell over Washington was not the silence of peace, but the silence of caution, as sources dried up and whistleblowers went underground. Internationally, the hearing sent shockwaves through the Five Eyes intelligence alliance, causing a diplomatic strain that was discussed in hushed tones at embassies around the world. Allies in London, Ottawa, and Canberra expressed private concerns that the politicization of the FBI and the broader US intelligence community made American agencies unreliable partners. There were fears that sensitive intelligence shared with the US might be weaponized for domestic political purposes or, conversely, that the US was no longer interested in threats that did not fit the administration's narrative. Intelligence sharing protocols were quietly reviewed, with some partners deciding to withhold raw data in favor of finalized assessments to protect their own sources and methods. The perception of the FBI as a professional, apolitical investigative body, a reputation built over decades, was eroding rapidly, replaced by the image of a partisan enforcer. Despite the outcry from the opposition and the international community, the director's strategy appeared to be paying dividends in the court of public opinion that mattered most to the White House. Polling data released a week after the hearing showed a sharp uptick in approval for the administration's handling of crime and border security, particularly in key swing districts. The imagery of federal agents aggressively tackling gang members and securing the border, regardless of the civil liberties concerns raised by Hirono, resonated with voters who felt unsafe. The administration leaned into this, using clips of Hirono's questioning in campaign advertisements to portray the Democrats as soft on crime and obsessed with bureaucratic niceties while the country burned. The narrative that the FBI was finally doing its job drowned out the nuanced arguments about procedural justice and institutional norms. Senator Hirono and her colleagues on the Oversight Committee attempted to maintain the pressure, issuing subpoenas for the documents that Patel had refused to provide during his testimony. However, the executive branch responded with a blanket claim of executive privilege, leading to a protracted legal battle that seemed destined to die in the slow-moving appellate courts. The legislative branch found itself effectively neutered, possessing the power to ask questions but lacking the enforcement mechanism to compel answers from a defiant executive. This stalemate highlighted a constitutional crisis that had been building for years: the collapse of congressional oversight in the face of a unitary executive theory that recognized no co-equal branch. The hearing ultimately served as a case study in the limits of legislative power in the modern era. As the weeks turned into months, the Patel Doctrine became the standard operating procedure for federal law enforcement, fundamentally reshaping the relationship between the citizen and the state. The FBI's focus shifted almost entirely to violent crime, immigration enforcement, and the investigation of anti-American radicalism, while white-collar crime and civil rights enforcement withered on the vine. The agency's new recruitment drives, focusing on military veterans and rural police officers, began to alter the demographic face of the Bureau, creating a force that was more culturally aligned with the administration's base. The G-man of the 20th century, the suit-wearing accountant lawyer, was replaced by the tactical operator, heavily armed and ideologically driven. This cultural shift ensured that the changes instituted by Patel would outlast his tenure, creating a deep bench of loyalists who would ascend the ranks in the coming decades. The hearing also marked a turning point in the rhetoric of the opposition, who began to call openly for the dismantling or radical restructuring of the FBI itself. In a supreme irony, the political left, once the defenders of federal institutions against conservative attacks, now found themselves echoing the defund rhetoric, arguing that the Bureau was too broken to be saved. Proposals began to circulate in think tanks about breaking up the FBI's responsibilities, stripping it of its domestic intelligence powers, and returning it to a purely criminal investigative role. This complete inversion of traditional party platforms regarding law enforcement signaled a profound realignment in American politics. Trust in the federal police power had collapsed on both sides, leaving the agency in a precarious existential position. In the long arc of history, The confrontation between Senator Hirono and Director Patel would likely be viewed as the moment when the facade of the apolitical Department of Justice finally crumbled completely. It was the moment when the tacit agreement to keep the coercive powers of the state out of the partisan arena was explicitly repudiated in favor of a winner-takes-all approach to governance. The director's testimony laid bare the reality that in a polarized society, neutral institutions